Hidden by London's elegant public buildings, just yards from Trafalgar Square, is a dark, forbidding block known as the Citadel. 60 years ago, this bunker was at the heart of the secret war against Hitler's U-boats. In an airless sub-basement, 20 feet below the ground, naval intelligence sought to track the enemy in the Atlantic. At first, with little success. Britain depended on its lifeline to North America. But in the first 18 months of war, the Germans sank more than 5 million tons of shipping. It was a battle for survival, and Britain was losing it. But in the spring of 1941, a new source of intelligence began to flow into the Citadel, which promised to transform the Battle of the Atlantic and to shape victory from defeat. On May the 7th, 1941, a British listening station intercepted a signal to a U-boat on war patrol in the Atlantic. It was from U-boat headquarters. That much was clear. But the message itself was in code. Dozens of signals like this were intercepted every day. If sense could be made of them, naval intelligence would be able to locate an enemy hidden in 3 million square miles of ocean. The signal was sent to a U-boat hunting in the waters south of Greenland, the U-110. The message was encoded on an Enigma machine. The settings for this machine were changed daily, and the tables containing the settings were changed every month.
How safe was the code? We were told that the odds were at least 1 to a million. You could say that it was as safe as winning the jackpot on the lottery. The Enigma machine on its own wasn't enough to break the code. You also needed the code tables.
The message from headquarters promised immediate action. The first for the U-110 in almost 2 weeks.
A convoy had been spotted, and we were ordered by U-boat headquarters to try and intercept it. We were at last close enough to be able to do that.
The U-110's commander, Fritz Julius Lemp, was an experienced hunter, a holder of the Knight's Cross, Germany's most prestigious decoration. The convoy was sighted on the morning of May the 9th. Lemp chose to risk a daylight attack.
Then we attacked, fired at 2 steamers. I followed the torpedoes until they hit the targets.
Suddenly, there was a terrific explosion, I think on the starboard bow, and we knew a ship had been torpedoed. Then another ship was hit. Turned the convoy the other way, raced over, started picking up the contacts.
I said to my mate, Fritz, listen, they've got us. We're being echolocated.
The last depth charges caused serious damage. We had water and diesel oil leaking into the U-boat.
The control room looked like a wrecked kitchen. The lights went out, and, well, it really was the end.
The U-boat, like the one filmed here, shot to the surface, taking the Royal Navy escort ships by surprise.
It is the dream, of course, when you attack, to have the U-boat coming to the surface. It happens so seldom. As we opened fire, and the noise in that U-boat must have been absolutely terrific.
Alles raus! Geht's als erstes!
I can still hear Commander Lemp as he opened the hatch. He shouted down, "Ulandstrasse, last stop, all change." This was the last stop for us.
I climbed from the control room through the tower up to the bridge. The commander was standing there. I said, "Sir, the secret things are still down there." He just said, "Leave it, Wilde. The boat's sinking anyway."
The British rescued those they could, but 17 of the crew, including Commander Lemp, were lost. The U-110 remained stubbornly afloat.
My captain turned to me and said, "Look, you sub, you take the boarding party. Get what you can out of her." One couldn't believe that they just left this U-boat. I felt sure there must be somebody down below. And so, going down that last ladder with my revolver holstered, I felt terribly vulnerable, very frightened. Very eerie. No noise at all, deathly silence. Nobody there. So I then shouted up to my boarding party, who I'd left on deck, to come down. We started collecting everything we could. And the telegraphist came along to me and said, "Look, there's something very interesting here, you better come and see." So I went along, and there was this typewriter thing. We both pressed a few buttons and lit up in a rather strange way. And of course, a mass of cipher books, which didn't mean anything to us.
Four days later, the intelligence haul was delivered to a Victorian mansion in the Buckinghamshire countryside. This was Bletchley Park, the government code and cipher school, a place so secret it was known in official documents as Station X. By 1941, the Bletchley codebreakers were able to read both German Army and Air Force signals. Only the Navy's Enigma codes were unbroken. The material from the U-110 helped to change all that.
We got out almost everything in spring-summer of 1941. There may have been an occasional day that didn't come out or something, but no, to steady success.
The intelligence material captured in the spring offered the cryptographers enough of an insight into the mechanics of the codes for them to crack the daily wheel settings, even when in the summer the tables changed.
After June and July were over, when we had the messages on a plate, then we had to solve each day separately, and it was an extremely satisfying job. And each time you had to do some work, and you knew what you were doing was useful. Wonderful.
By the summer of 1941, a flood of decrypted signals was clattering down the secure teleprinter lines from Bletchley to the Admiralty. It was known as Ultra, or Special Intelligence.
The speed with which the decrypts came into us, there were just piles and piles of them, and we were reading enemy traffic and knowing what they were doing, probably at the same time as the recipient of the signal.
At the other end of the teleprinter line was the Admiralty's Intelligence Centre, the Citadel. At the heart of this secret bunker, a small team of intelligence officers sought to track U-boats in the Atlantic. The submarine tracking room was to mirror operations at U-boat headquarters. And lest anyone forget, a grim portrait of Karl Dönitz, the leader of the U-boat arm, hung on the wall. In the summer of 1941, Ultra was to transform the work of the tracking room and the battle in the Atlantic. On June 21st, a British cruiser sank the German supply ship Babatonga, one of the network put in place to refuel surface raiders and U-boats at sea. Within a month, naval intelligence was able to lead British warships to 9 German tankers. It was a severe blow to Dönitz's plans for long-distance operations in the Atlantic. To make matters worse, his U-boats were also struggling to find convoys closer to home. In May 1941, they'd sunk 58 ships. In July, just 17. Dönitz began to suspect an intelligence failure.
He'd sent his signals and intelligence officer to Berlin, and this man was told, "Find out if everything is okay. Can we trust this?" And again he would return with reassuring words, "Nothing can have happened. It's got to be okay." But one always felt that Dönitz had, I'd say, a premonition that something wasn't quite right, you know.
On the day the British captured the Enigma materials from the U-110, Admiral Dönitz was appearing in a film being given its gala premiere in Berlin. The leading parts, with the exception of Dönitz, were played by actors, but the U-boat was real enough. The U-123 had already sunk 18 ships.
Größtes Zeichen. Verehrung des Leutnants zur See von Benedikt. Bitte ich Sie, Kaplan Hofmeister, seiner Mutter das U-Boots-Kriegsabzeichen zu erreichen. Kämpfen heißt opfern. Und siegen. Der Kampf geht weiter.
That summer, the U-123 was to set out on war patrol under a new commander.
It wasn't that simple taking over a successful boat. I had to impose myself, of course. The older crew members in particular were a bit reluctant to accept me, because our first voyage was a journey south to the equator. They'd never done a long voyage, so it wasn't easy getting them behind me.
Hardegen was determined to make his mark. His maiden voyage in 123 was to take him south along the African coast, where hunting was supposed to be good. At first, it was. By the end of June 1941, he was able to report his first successes to Dönitz.
At battle stations, turned onto a parallel course. A hit at the bridge and a bright fiery glow. There's an oil patch at the site of the sinkings, and a few people are floating in the water, holding spars.
But U-123's war patrol was being tracked by the British. Hardagen's signals were read in the Citadel just hours after he'd sent them. Time enough for convoys to be directed away from U-123. The tracking room was carrying out the same operation with a dozen more U-boats right across the North Atlantic. On June 24th, Dönitz sent a message to his commanders urging them to press home the attack more vigorously. For naval intelligence, this was confirmation that the U-boats were experiencing a lean time. Dönitz was tetchy.
Das Auffinden von Zielen.
Finding targets, how should I put it? This was getting harder and harder.
Die
The U-boat locations were known, and the convoys were being directed around them.
U-123's war patrol began to fizzle out. At least for the U-boats in these waters, there was time to relax in the African sunshine.
I organized a deck party with sausage snatching, shark fishing, and the crew was able to swim.
The water was around 30 degrees. It was lovely. We could have a nice shower. We took our clothes off. Everyone was naked, you know.
Klamotten runter, die waren alle nackt. Nee.
By July the 14th, U-123 had reached Freetown on the coast of Sierra Leone. This was an assembly point for convoys preparing to make the journey home to Britain. There were hopes at last of an easy success. They were short-lived. The Royal Navy had been tipped off by U-123's own signals, and now the only ships passing in and out of Freetown were the ones they couldn't sink.
We had them in our sights, and we wanted to sink them. But when it got dark, they were brightly lit, and they all had the American flag on their sides. They were neutral, and we couldn't do anything.
Hitler had personally ordered that a signal be sent to U-boats expressly forbidding contact with American ships. The frustration of Hardegen and his crew was mirrored across the U-boat arm that summer. The failure of its codes compounded by the presence of an enemy it couldn't touch.
We had very strict orders to avoid anything that could cloud the relationship. But one already felt in those days that the Americans were doing quite a lot that couldn't truly be reconciled with neutrality.
Mit Neutralität nicht mehr ganz zu vereinbaren war.
We shall give every possible assistance to Britain and to all who with Britain are resisting Hitlerism or its equivalent. All additional measures necessary to deliver the goods will be taken.
By the summer of 1941, half the food Britain imported and many of the weapons she needed to fight the war were passing across the Atlantic from North America, and Britain was pressing for more.
The one thing we hoped was that the Americans would come into the war. If they did, that would be it. The war would be won. Of course, it has to be said there were many people who were very, very much in favor of Britain and who would be glad to get into the war, of whom President Roosevelt was one.
The growing warmth of this friendship was demonstrated in August, when Churchill steamed across the Atlantic for a shipboard summit with Roosevelt. The president came bearing gifts. British sailors were given cigarettes and fruit, a taste of life as it was once lived at home. American sailors were able to meet the British Prime Minister. The two leaders gave voice to their unity of purpose in a joint service aboard the battleship Prince of Wales. Churchill got what he wanted. Roosevelt agreed to bend the bounds of neutrality even further. American warships would begin protecting British convoys in the Western Atlantic.
The USA declared a security zone, an exclusion zone, and that was, for us, of course, nonsense. We regarded the whole of the Atlantic as our operational area, but the Americans attacked a number of submarines in the Western Atlantic. It regarded them as pirates.
Angegriffen als Piraten betrachtet.
The Admiralty was now confident that the tide of battle was turning its way. Its figures showed that in the last 6 months of 1941, shipping losses had more than halved. The U-boat was struggling to find targets. When it did, it risked confronting the muscular neutrality of the United States. But it was clear this standoff couldn't last forever. On October the 31st, Eric Topp's U-552 was hunting in the waters southeast of Greenland.
I came upon the convoy in the early hours of the morning and attacked immediately with 2 torpedoes.
Mit 2 Torpedos. Die Reuben James wurde getroffen.
The Reuben James was hit and burst into flames, and 110 men lost their lives in the icy cold water. Oil spouted out of the ship into the sea, and in places this was on fire. Then, unfortunately, after the boat started to sink, her depth charges began to explode, and that tossed the survivors high up into the air. They were thrown up to a height of 15 meters, and of course hit the water again in a very badly wounded state.
Und sind dann also natürlich schwer verwundet wieder aufs Wasser geschlagen.
Topp's U-552 sank the first American warship before there was officially a war to fight. In the Atlantic, at least, the United States was now at war with Germany, in all but name.
I reported every detail of the attack to Dönitz, and he said nothing more than, "It's all right, you acted correctly."
Dönitz approved, Hitler did not. Topp wasn't disciplined, but Hitler still refused to rescind his orders. No more attacks on American ships. By December, the U-boat war had almost ground to a halt. But the issue was settled 5 weeks later, not in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific.
This is the Arizona, writhing in death agony, awakening America to battle and rallying America to a new battle cry. Remember Pearl Harbor.
Hitler was surprised by the Japanese airstrike at Pearl Harbor, but in support of his ally, he now declared war on the United States. Dönitz and his crews were delighted.
Der Kriegseintritt der Vereinigten Staaten.
The entry of the United States into the war was, I would almost say, a relief.
Erlösung, dass man jetzt also wusste, wir können das.
We could now respond to what the Americans had already been doing to us in terms of hostile attacks.
Könnten wir jetzt nun auch beantworten.
Preparations began for Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. Now at last was an opportunity to breathe new life into the faltering U-boat campaign. Just 5 large U-boats were to spearhead the attack on the United States. One was the U-123. Hardhagen and his crew set out for the new combat area on Christmas Eve 1941.
A few of us were already wondering whether we would get back from there in one piece. It was a fair way.
Het is een ziemlich lange Reise gewesen, nicht?
Ich hatte überhaupt keine Sichtkarten von drüben.
I had no charts for America. I had a Knauer pocket atlas, and in it there was a small city map of New York. That was all I had.
Von New York, das war alles, was ich hatte.
U-123's arrival would not go unannounced. There was Ultra. On January the 10th, 1942, a message was intercepted and delivered to Bletchley. It was an order from Dönitz to the drumbeat boats. It was clear an attack was building off the American coast. But the eyes of the American Navy were still turned to the Pacific. The warning reached a desk of its Naval Intelligence Service, but no action was taken.
In those first days after Pearl Harbor, it really was a pantomime. But then you've got to remember the United States is a hell of a long way from anywhere else. And Americans are not accustomed to think of people attacking them on their own shores.
On January the 13th, U-123 inched its way into New York Bay. Operation Drumbeat had begun.
I had
flooded the front tank so that only the tower showed. What American fisherman would recognize a German U-boat tower? I'd assumed that I would find a coast that was blacked out. There was a war on, after all. But ships were sailing with their navigation lights shining brightly.
We could see the cars driving along the coast road. And I remember we could even smell the woods.
Die Wälder gerochen haben.
I waited until the ships left New York. Then I would sail behind them until they were in about 40, 50 meters of water, and then sink them.
Rohr 1, los! Rohr 1, los! Läuft!
The night of the long knives. A drumbeat with 8 ships sunk, including 3 tankers. If only there'd been 10 or 20 U-boats here with me, they would all have had successes aplenty.
Hardhagen was able to report to U-boat headquarters that American waters were teeming with ships unprotected by convoy. The U-boat could sink at will.
We had expected there would be some successes at the beginning, but we hadn't expected they would be as great. That was, let's say, A nice surprise.
Sagen wir mal, gute Überraschung.
This was not what the Admiralty had anticipated when the United States entered the war. Losses began to climb. 48 ships in January, 95 by March. There was worse news. On the 1st of February 1942, naval intelligence was obliged to report that the flow of Ultra was at an end. Bletchley had lost access to the key Enigma code.
The work dried up and everything stopped. Nothing was happening at all. And we were really rather desperate. It had a very bad effect. People walked around with long faces, particularly the cryptographers, who were almost in despair.
Dönitz had insisted on the change. There were just too many coincidences. Too many convoys missed. Too many supply ships sunk. A new four-wheel Enigma machine had been issued to the Atlantic boats, and a new code called Shark. It was enough to ensure the Ultra tap was turned off just when the United States needed its help.
We were very miserable about not being able to get into the Shark. We knew that was much more important than anything else that we could do. We knew what the sinkings were like.
On April the 8th, 1942, the tanker Esso Baton Rouge was passing along the coast of Georgia. These were dangerous waters. They'd become a favorite hunting ground for the U-boat. After 4 months of war, there was still no convoy protection. Nor had most Americans woken to the new Pearl Harbor unfolding on their doorstep.
All the businesses, and they wouldn't dim their lights. And a ship going up the coast or coming down, you were silhouetted against this light. This is like a shooting gallery. You know, you picture yourself sitting out there on about 120, 140,000 barrels of high-octane gas. There's something to think about.
There were many who refused to sail on tankers. They were an especially prized target. In the first 4 months of America's war, more than 50 were sunk on the East Coast and in the Caribbean. The Esso Baton Rouge was a little more than 2 miles offshore when her shadow was spotted by Hardagen's U-123.
Boom, she says. I don't know how high up in the air I went because it was right under me, just about. I don't know if it knocked me out or what, but when I come to, I says, holy mackerel. You know the first thing out of my mouth? First thing out of my mouth, please God help me now. The first thing out of my mouth.
9 days after the sinking of the Baton Rouge, all tanker traffic on the East Coast was suspended. The US Navy was unable to protect shipping in its own waters. It was fighting a war in 2 oceans, and in the Atlantic, it was losing.
I was a pretty sick cookie. I'd come home, my mother would put a rubber mat in the bed, because I would have such nightmares. I'd wake up in a pool of water, sweating so bad. Boy, I'd get some doozies. One time I was running down a hall howling general quarters. Could you believe it?
The tin fish has surfaced, and like all fish out of water, is doomed if it remains there too long.
Much was made in the newsreels of an American counterattack. The public was told of hundreds of hunt and destroy missions. Of 15 U-boats sunk in the first 3 months of the war.
Planes would come and drop a few bombs. We would only laugh about that because they were so far away they had no effect. But they always reported, "I've sunk a U-boat."
Return to base. Okay.
We were supposed to have been sunk 3 times. Every time we sank a ship, we were sunk again. The Americans needed this as a consolation, the idea that they had done something, but it wasn't true.
Despite the American claims, no U-boats were sunk in United States waters in the first 3 months of the war. And with tankers burning off the beaches, it was impossible to hide the failure of the Navy's response. Operation Drumbeat breathed new life into the U-boat war. Dönitz's boats were sinking more than 400,000 tons of shipping a month. Hardagen's U-123 alone sank 19 ships on its 2 patrols to the United States.
We were the ones who'd had the greatest success, and the reception and the propaganda circus around us was correspondingly noisy. I was a little embarrassed at times, because in fact, we hadn't encountered much resistance.
Then Dönitz pinned the Knight's Cross on me on the deck of my boat. That was, of course, a special moment.
Dönitz had good cause for satisfaction. Everyone wanted to be part of what the crews called the Great American Turkey Shoot. U-boat headquarters didn't care where in the Atlantic the successes were won, just as long as more ships were sunk than the Allies could build. Dönitz sent all the U-boats he could muster to American waters. This was made possible by a new type of submarine, which, thanks to the change in the Enigma code, was a well-guarded secret. U-boats were now able to rendezvous off the American coast with giant underwater tankers loaded with up to 700 tons of fuel, food, and torpedoes. A U-boat could now double the length of its war patrol on the American coast. Staff at the Admiralty were unable to contain the frustration. There was sharp criticism of their American allies' failure to introduce convoys sooner. The monthly total for June was to be the worst of the war. 173 ships sunk. These losses were threatening the whole Allied war effort. But for all the Admiralty's anger, its grim statistics hid a new and disturbing trend. A growing number of ships were being sunk many miles from the American coast. U-boats had struggled to find ships the summer before. Now they seemed able to find them, even in the middle of the Atlantic. When a ship was sunk here, the chances of survival were slim, and the U-boat crews knew it.
I suddenly realised that about 100 feet away was this thumping great U-boat. And the machine guns were manned, she had a couple of cannon, they were manned, and we all thought that was it. Instead he asked someone to come alongside, and he handed out bread, tins of butter and some first aid dressings, and he said, we'll report your position after dark, and good luck, and took off then. I think it was the worst time that first night in many ways. You began to think about how a few hours ago you were having breakfast and you ought to be having jolly good dinner now.
You're wet and icy cold. Your backside would sit on the hard surface, wet clothes, rocking, thrown about like that. You're never still.
Each man got a quarter of this can of pemmican. It's like fruit and chopped up meat, a lot of coconut oil, pressed in like a little sardine can. And they'd get 2 malted milk tablets, and they'd get this little container of water about the size of a shotgun shell. They got that twice a day. And that was their ration.
You see a wave the size of a house coming towards you in an open boat with 17 chaps in it, and you think this one's going to come over the top, and you thought, this is it, this time.
We had 2 helmets in the boat, so there was always 2 men with those helmets bailing water. You just kept at it, because if you gave up, you were done, and you knew this.
As the days wore on, your tongue started to swell, and all you thought about was when was the water coming around, when's the water. You longed to drink something.
When I was a child, I read Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. There's a lovely illustration in that book, The Ghost of Plenty, sat up in front of a giant fire, log fire, with fruit and food and mulled wines and all sorts of things around him. And every time I closed my eyes, I could see that.
From the summer of 1942, many of the merchant seamen forced to undergo this ordeal were paying the price for a catastrophic British intelligence failure. The breaking of the German Enigma codes was of immense value to the Admiralty, and yet it was cavalier about the security of its own codes. It relied on book ciphers, easy to use, but often easier to penetrate. Little effort was made to disguise the code's indicator, the key for anyone decrypting a signal. By the summer of 1942, the Germans had cracked the British convoy codes.
Their most successful U-boat pack attacks on our convoys were based on information obtained by breaking our ciphers. The Germans were doing just about as well with our ciphers breaking them as we were doing with Ultra. In fact, at times, they may be doing better.
Thousands of signals were sent to Allied ships every week. As much as 80% of those sent in one code were read by the Germans. A secret report written for the Admiralty after the war admitted it had cost the country dearly in men and ships, and nearly lost us the war at sea. By the time the U-boat returned to the convoy ward later that summer, the intelligence advantage rested with Dönitz. He would use it to direct his packs against convoys deep into the North Atlantic, 1,000 miles or so away from land.
Before the end of 3 weeks, we realized we were really in trouble because the food was going down. And we saw all these fish swimming around with sharks. And these pilot fish, they would swim real close to the boat. And you just pitch them in the belly and throw them in the boat. And you'd probably miss 50 of them before you got one.
Your tongue, which was black, your lips were black. These boils, which are all over your legs, painful, because your legs were in salt water most of the time.
We would read the Testament, the New Testament. We had a book with us. We'd read that 2 or 3 times a day. Well, I think it kind of settles your mind.
I can remember being at home and playing tennis, in fact, and I wasn't in that boat for quite a long time. It was uncanny, really.
This guy, we found out he'd been torpedoed before, and mentally he was not with it. And he'd lay his money out in the boat, and he'd give somebody a $5 bill and tell him to call the water taxi. He wanted to go ashore. And then we got in this terrible storm one night, and as we were all doing our thing, he just stood up in the middle of the boat and he jumped. He just literally jumped right out of the boat, and we never saw that man again. You know, it's kind of heartbreaking. He'd been through so much, and then he just decided he had it.
It was a grey, cold North Atlantic day, and somebody saw this shape on the horizon.
And it was an Icelandic trawler, and its name was Surprise. Some surprise.
Put on the Mystic in a hammock, and the crew of the Snowflake, I can't speak enough.
To us it was emotional. To them, they picked up survivors before, and it meant really not that much to them until such time as they were finally understanding what we were telling them, how long we were out there. Then they couldn't believe it.
U-boats sank a staggering 1,100 ships in 1942. More than 30,000 British seamen were forced to take to lifeboats. 10,000 lost their lives. It was the costliest year of the war at sea so far. At the beginning of the war, Dönitz had announced that with enough U-boats, he would secure victory in the Atlantic. Then he'd commanded just 57. Now, at the start of 1943, he had 393.